Good afternoon. Welcome to our conversation on developmental disability and child welfare. What do you need to know? What do we need to know? My name is Naomi Reddish, and I coordinate the Child Welfare Stipend program here at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Social Work. We are so glad you decided to join us today for this important conversation. I want to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. Hope Davis is an MSW student here at the VCU School of Social Work and has worked with the Child Welfare Stipend program this year as a research assistant. And Hope is going to get us started today and introduce our panelist for this conversation. So Hope, I want to welcome you today.
Hi, thank you, Naomi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hope Davis, and I'm currently an MSW student at VCU and a research assistant for the Child Welfare Stipend program. Thank you for joining us today for the panel on developmental disability and child welfare, what you need to know. The VCU Child Welfare Stipend program and the Virginia Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities program, or LEND, have collaborated together to bring experts in the field of disability and child welfare to have a conversation about this population that is often overlooked. A disproportionate number of children with developmental disabilities are involved in the child welfare system. The prevalence of developmental disability among children welfare involved youth suggested that 22% of youth aged 0 through 18 had a developmental disability. To deliver quality services to children and families, child welfare professionals must possess a large set of competencies to work with these diverse communities. This is important because children with impairments are so common in child welfare. Gaining disability competency is a significant part of practice. For practitioners that are interacting with this population, there's an understanding that the complexity of the system of child welfare and the intersectionality of children with disabilities contributes to the difficulty of finding access to resources to meet the needs of the population. The hope of this event is to continue the conversation of disability and child welfare for practitioners in their agencies and in their communities. By having these conversations, we can work together to ask, how do we start and where do we go from here? Some topics that we'll be discussing during this panel will facilitate information on the ABCs of developmental disability and what child welfare workers need to know when working with children and caregivers with developmental disabilities. At the end of the panel, a survey will be sent in chat to give the audience an opportunity to give their insight on the questions asked today. A resource guide will also be provided to help practitioners that are currently in the field. So I want to go ahead and welcome a few of the panelists that will be joining us today. The first panelist is Heather Akin, an independent living coordinator through Richmond City Department of Social Services. Heather has 15 years of experience working in the field, providing services as well as promoting education in the area of child welfare. Our next panelist that we have is Dr. Bogenschutz. Dr. Matt Bogenschutz centers his research on the policies and practices that support community living for people with disabilities. He's also the director of the Virginia LEND program, which brings together students and faculty from 16 disciplines to learn about providing quality service to children with neurodevelopmental disabilities and their families. Our last panelist that will be joining us today is Aaran Kelley. Aaran Kelley is a VCU MSW alumni. They graduated in 2018 with their MSW. They serve as the Family First Project Manager with VDSS. They have almost a decade of state and local child welfare experience across the continuum of prevention, protection, and permanency with a focus on older youth in transitioning out of foster care. They provide technical assistance and consultation to local departments of social services to support students with disabilities who are in foster care. I will go ahead and turn over the next segment to Dr. Bogenschutz.
Okay, so thank you very much for being here, everyone, and thank you for the invite to join you. So I want to get us started today by giving a brief overview about what we're talking about when we're talking about developmental disabilities. So developmental disabilities are a very broad category, so it's really hard to nail down specifics based on this broad definition. But when we're talking about developmental disabilities, we're talking about conditions that begin before the age of 18 and are expected to continue indefinitely. They are conditions that can be intellectual, physical, about learning, about language, about behavior, a wide variety of manifestations. And by definition, they are conditions that we expect to continue indefinitely, and that cause difficulties in one or more areas of everyday function for a person. So those could be things as basic as eating or getting dressed in the morning, or it can be things like learning or keeping up in school. Any number of different things can be considered as functional limitations. So that's the broad definition of what we're talking about with developmental disabilities. Some common developmental disabilities that you may know about would include autism, cerebral palsy, intellectual disability, ADHD, fetal alcohol spectrum, hearing and vision impairments. These all fall under the category of developmental disabilities, and many more. There's a long, long list of diagnoses that would fall underneath this big banner. What are not developmental disabilities are disabilities that are identified outside of childhood, so outside of age 20, outside of age 18. And they do not include things that are acquired during childhood. So for example, if someone has a traumatic brain injury when they're 16, that is not considered to be a developmental disability. Oftentimes we can identify developmental disabilities right away when a child is born. Oftentimes we cannot. So for things like autism or ADHD or fetal alcohol, oftentimes it takes until the child is a bit older for us to be able to identify those disabilities. But for things like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, we can identify those straight away at birth, or sometimes even before birth. So that's the big picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about developmental disabilities. It's a large spectrum of conditions with a large spectrum of presentations and a large spectrum of ways to support folks.
Thank you, Dr. Bogenschutz. So what we will go ahead and do now is we will begin the panel discussion. The questions will also be delivered in chat for those that will need to see the question. So for our panelists today, the first question that we have is, what do child welfare workers need to know about developmental disability and working with individuals and families with developmental disabilities?
I'll start off. I think the most important thing as a worker, if you suspect that a child or caregiver or parent has a developmental disability, have them assessed by a professional as soon as possible in order to determine their capacity to include a full-scale IQ. And using this evaluation, this comprehensive evaluation, as the framework in which we guide all services that we render.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's really important to be assessed straight away. We know that there are a lot of barriers to this. We know that especially the research has shown for years that kids from lower income families get assessed way later. Oftentimes, Black and Latinx kids get assessed a lot later than white kids do. There are a lot of challenges to getting assessed, especially for something like autism that may not present itself typically in every child. So this means that you need to be very, very aware, and you need to really be alert to the fact that developmental disabilities are way more common than we realize. In addition to getting the official evaluation done through a CSP or through a medical provider, schools are also incredibly important in the early stages. especially if a child is before the age of 3, getting the child referred to Part C services as soon as possible is really important. And the schools can then help to navigate a lot of other things. So all of that is really important. Referring the family to the local community service board is very important as well. So there are many things you can do to intervene, but the most important thing is to intervene straight away.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Matt and Heather on that. Coming from a more macro system, working at the state level in child welfare, I do think a lot about our local partners and who are working on the front line, right? So our child welfare workers as social workers are really have to be a lot of things to a lot of people, right? And they can't be experts at all of it. So it's important to remember that while we need to have a base knowledge in developmental disabilities and disabilities in general for all of our young people who are involved in the system, my macro approach is making sure that we're utilizing those partnerships that we have, right? So if we have some basis, like Heather said, if we're questioning, if we're concerned, if anybody on that child's team says, you know what, I think maybe this child needs to be assessed, let's get that assessment. Let's use those partnerships that we have with our local school divisions, with our local community service boards, our mental health agencies, so that we're all working together as well as working with those families, right? So whether we're working with a family on the front end in that what we prevention or protection end, where it's where we're working with the family directly, hopefully trying to prevent any need for foster care, or whether the child has been placed in foster care, understanding that our families have a great amount of knowledge about that young person and what their needs are. So making sure that we're really partnering with them, getting the assessments that we need, being an advocate for those families and those children when we're going to the schools and asking for that assessment, when we're looking for the right services, and making sure that we're really taking that team approach so that we can get those young people what they need.
I think even beyond the assessments, because sometimes you'll come into contact with a family with a child or a parent who has an existing condition, an existing diagnosis. But we also need to realize that a developmental disability is a lifelong condition, right? So I want to come back to that as well. And people's needs change over time. And just because someone was assessed and diagnosed and maybe there was some intervention earlier in their life does not mean that they're still in a good place with their supports and services today. And I think this is where a lot of times we run into problems in the child welfare system where someone may have been assessed when they were 3 years old for autism, let's say, and they may have gotten early intervention for autism, but once that early intervention falls off, or once their original 504 plan for school is expired, they may not have much at all. And the child's needs may change, and the parent may not be able to keep up and adapt. They may not know where to turn. And this can cause a lot of things that wind the child and the family into the child welfare system. So reassessing constantly is super important, and always responding to the needs of not just the child, but the family to live the life they need to live and to get the supports that they need in order to live that life is really, really important. So we just always need to understand disability as being dynamic and that it's an entire family system issue for us to really be thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you. That was so informative. So we'll be moving on to the next question. My next question to the panelists are, where do you see your staff and team struggling in regard to service delivery to this population?
I am very confident answering this. Unfortunately, there is a huge disconnect in those intersecting systems that are designed to service the needs of this specific population. Each system, such as child welfare, education, community services board, those partnerships that were referenced earlier in the training, we operate in silos, and unknowingly we are creating systematic barriers for the children that we serve. The competencies I've developed as a child welfare worker have come from just trying to navigate these systems and navigate the practices that are put into place with these systems. A lot of times I do not have control over things that you would think I would have more control over, considering that the child is in our care and our custody. So the greatest challenges that I see that workers face involve education, lack of available placements, and access to services for those who may not meet certain eligibility criteria.
Yeah, I agree, Heather. And to add on to that, part of my background is that I have acted as the state point of contact on the child welfare side for educational stability for our children and youth in foster care. So basically, where that comes from is there is federal law in place, and there's some Virginia legislation that mirrors that around the right of children and youth who are in foster care to maintain their the school that they have been going to, even though when they come into foster care, they are oftentimes changing school zones at the very least, if not crossing a division line as well. And so the law says that they either have the right to remain in the school that they were already in when they entered foster care or when they change a placement in foster care, or they have the right to be immediately enrolled into the new school division if that's what's in that child's best interest. So there, like I said, amazing federal law, state legislation that helps to mirror that and reinforce that. But what is also happening at the same time is, as you know, so many of our young people also have a disability. And so then there is IDEA, which is our federal Disabilities Act for education, that talks about what children who are who have IEPs and 504 plans and what have you, the rights that they have. And oftentimes, because of the way Virginia code and the federal legislation coming from these two different places comes together, it actually winds up being in conflict with one another, even though they're both really great for what they were intended to do. When they overlap, we do see issues with that immediate enrollment or maintaining a child in their school division. And so the issues that we often have are our cases become so complicated. And then the worker is concerned with, how am I meeting all of my requirements, making sure that I'm doing X, Y, and Z so that I'm meeting the federal and the state stuff on the educational stability side. But then and then the schools are also going, okay, but we also need to make sure that we're meeting IDEA. And so, and like Heather mentioned, you know, kind of a shortage of placements for our really high need youth we see often, and a delay in getting those youth into those placements, especially when they have moved a significant amount of a significant distance away from their original location when they come into foster care. And so it's just really tough, I know, for workers to feel like they are under pressure to get all of these things right, when in reality, some of them just, the laws don't play nice together in the first place.
And to piggyback on that, for example, something that has consumed my past 2 months, I had a young lady transitioning out of residential. She has a number of disabilities, which include numerous developmental disabilities. She does have an individualized education plan, an IEP, which specifically outlines educational services, supports, and interventions. Because of her IEP and because of these systematic barriers that I referenced, this child has sat out of school for almost 2 months. In that 2-month time, 2 foster homes have disrupted, because a foster home may feel as though they can meet a child's needs, but if you have a full-time working foster parent that works from home, the expectation and under which they brought the child into the home is not the same as where we are right now. I'm sure many of you are aware that across the country and in Virginia, in Richmond, children are sleeping in the offices of social services. Children are being denied from placements due to the placement's inability to safely meet their individual needs. I think if we look a little deeper, there's going to be a common theme that we find, and that many of these children do have a cognitive level of functioning that goes outside of most of the licensures that run group homes and residentials that we contract with. And I think if we look at that common theme and the effectiveness of the treatment that they have historically received, that there are going to be some common themes. Individuals with intellectual disability or with borderline intellectual disability are unlikely to have the cognitive ability to benefit from trademark talk therapy and psychoeducational groups. It is recommended that the most important intervention for them would be behavior modification therapy.
And I'll note that in my community, that's sometimes controversial, although I definitely understand where it comes from. So in the disability advocacy community, we think that disability is a normal part of human diversity. I'm sure most of you agree with that. And it's not to say that doing behavioral therapies is wrong, but it needs to be part of a choice-making process that folks make along with the professionals involved. Another big issue that I think we see, or that I see as the director of the LEN program, which is very interdisciplinary in nature, is that there just aren't providers to help families in many parts of the state, even in parts of the state where you would think that there would be lots of providers who are able to provide great disability services and supports. There oftentimes are not, or they're running large waiting lists. So even here in the Richmond area or in Northern Virginia, where we have a lot more resources, a lot of service providers are running huge waiting lists to be able to provide supports for people with disabilities and their families. And then of course it's even more challenging when we get into maybe Southwest Virginia or Southside Virginia. Oftentimes folks have to drive for hours to get a simple physical therapy appointment, for example. And speech therapy may or may not exist in their community, right? So we have a huge shortage of trained professionals. We try to fill that gap a little bit through programs like mine, but we're a mere drop in the bucket compared to the need that exists. So that's something that I would say is a dire need, is for more trained professionals in more parts of the state in order to be able to provide services and supports. And for to be honest, from a policy standpoint, for reimbursement rates for those folks to be better, so that doing work with people with disabilities is a bit more attractive, to be honest. Right now, we simply don't have reimbursement rates that encourage folks to set up services. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in, if that's okay, Hope, and circle back to something that Heather mentioned about youth sleeping in DSS offices. So this is kind of going off a little bit on a tangent, but I just wanted to touch base on that. The governor initiated a task force maybe 2 months ago now, called the Safe and Sound Task Force, out of a recognition that we have children and youth with such high degrees of needs, and oftentimes, and some of these are, developmental disabilities, but typically it's that it's an intersection, right? And it's a layering of behavioral health issues and lots of trauma that have gone on, lots of things that are happening, and they're just how we say disrupting out of a placement. So they've been placed with a family, whether that's a relative or non-relative foster family. Maybe they've been in a therapeutic group home or even a residential treatment facility, and they are now, but they've disrupted for one of many reasons. And because they have such high needs, local departments are having a really hard time finding a family or another congregate care setting like a group home or a residential treatment facility that has the capacity to care for that child. And so what we have found is that those placements are disrupting. The worker has to go pick that child up, and then they physically don't have anywhere to take them. And so they wind up working through the night with the child sleeping on the couch in the office while they're trying to find that next placement. And so from a state standpoint, let me just be clear, it's not okay. We are not okay with that. The governor is not okay with that. The local agencies are not okay with that. But it's kind of the hand they're being dealt, especially with our mental health worker shortage at the moment. Our congregate care facilities that are have less beds available because they're short-staffed. All kinds of things that are going on that are playing into this. But we said the governor's task force is really bringing together folks at a state level to help work through those and make sure that those young people are getting placed in the right placements that can meet their needs. But it has become a bigger and bigger issue that, like I said, kind of got to the governor's attention, and we're working through that. And what systemic changes can we make, right? So we're dealing with putting the fires out for the ones that we have, we don't have a placement for right now, but also what other systemic changes do we need to make that are going to help support the field so that we don't have children and youth who are going through those sorts of things.
Thank you all for your perspectives on this question. I wanted to give any of you an opportunity to follow up with that. If you don't have any follow-up questions, we can go ahead and move on to the next question. Okay, I guess we're going to go ahead and move on. So the next question that I have for the panelists are, how do you engage with these families and individuals? What do workers need to think about in terms of preparing to communicate effectively with these families and individuals to gather pertinent information from the family, the child and youth, and service providers for quality assessment, intervention, and service planning?
This is something that initially as a new worker, I struggled with because it's changing the way you engage with people. Engagement is the foundation of the work that we do. Building those relationships with the children and parents and caregivers that we work with. But when you work with someone that has a developmental disability, especially those that have a cognitive disability, the manner in which we communicate and we deliver services is paramount. Some helpful tips that I have found is, in order to help see things through their perspective, allow them time to process the information that's being shared. Information that's processed in a multisensory way, whether that's hearing it, seeing it, writing it, or reading it, will help individuals retain that information. I have found written communication to be the most effective. In the email format, however, don't type an entire paragraph or multiple paragraphs of information. Bullet point that out. Make it as simple as possible, almost like an outline of a paper we would do in school. Utilizing written information also helps them to be able to go back and reread that information or share that information with someone that they are more comfortable talking about it with. I found texting is beneficial to those who struggle with their reading level. A lot of times they may not want to text information in fear of spelling something incorrectly. So talk to text is a feature that I've seen used a lot. When scheduling appointments or visitations, utilize a print off calendar. I look at an Outlook calendar every single day. That is what keeps me on track. And so that's also going to be beneficial to individuals that you work with. The most important thing that I have found, though, is when selecting service providers, ensure that they have the skill set in order to work with this specific population. For example, a parent that may be recommended they need some parenting services to enhance their parenting capacities. I have not found it beneficial sending them to a large parent class setting. It is overwhelming. there are a lot of people there. It's long. It is very hard to pay attention to information being presented in that format. I found it most beneficial obtaining additional funding for parent coaching or parent support partner. But even with that, when you call a service provider to ask them if they're available to provide the service, make sure you're connecting them with a service provider that has direct experience working with someone with a developmental disability or a cognitive delay. Because the way that they deliver that service is going to look different from the way that is delivered to someone that is on a normal functioning level.
Yeah, so I would love to, sorry, Matt, I would love to add to that a little bit. So a couple of things. One, thank you for pointing that out, Heather. I was also thinking about, we're talking a lot about our young people who have developmental disabilities, but also some of the parents that we work with have those as well, right? These are lifelong disabilities. And so our workers do need to be prepared to interact with parents who may also have some of those developmental disabilities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't parent, but that your interaction, your engagement with them may need to look different. Again, our frontline workers can't be perfect in everything. So again, use those partnerships, lean on someone else, find someone else at your agency. Heather, for instance, at Richmond City, has background working with community service boards with developmental and behavioral health issues. And so finding a colleague that has a little bit more of that expertise and being able to go to them and get some of that peer mentorship, I think is really helpful. Utilizing your supervision to ask those questions and say, I think I might have this situation. What do I do now? Or can I get some additional assistance? Is really important. And then that vetting, right, of folks what's going to be the best service, right? We're referring our families to these different services in hopes that it's going to support the family to be able to make the changes that are necessary so that the child welfare system can get out of their lives and that they have the support that they need. But again, we don't know all of the service providers, and we're not going to be experts on vetting every service provider, but some of that basic stuff you might know, right? If you have a child who is on the autism spectrum, if you're referring to play therapy, you're going to want to make sure that you're referring to a therapist that has experience and lists that as working with children on the spectrum, right? So, but also if you're not sure, going back to those partnerships, especially for services, you're needing to pay for those services. You're going to FAPT, which is through our CSA office, which is what helps pay for a lot of the services that aren't funded in other ways. That's a multidisciplinary team of folks that come together, and those folks are experts in your community. So really leaning on those partnerships with the other experts that are in your community to help you navigate those systems and make sure that you're making the best referrals. Like I said, our workers can't be everything for everybody and know it all. So the best we can do is really lean on the folks that have that expertise. And again, part of the people that have that expertise are the families that you are working with. They know themselves, they know their children, they know their families, and really trusting in their knowledge, in their opinion, and in their decision making, so that you can come to help support them in the best way that we can all support them.
Those are all great suggestions. I'll just add a couple of things as kind of a big picture disability etiquette and approach sort of perspective. The first thing that we always say in the disability community is we want any service provider to assume ability, right? Don't see a disability and then assume the person cannot do something. See the disability and say that they can do something, but may need a little bit of assistance in order to get there, right? So that's the first thing, is to see ability. The second thing is to always show respect. Oftentimes people with disabilities feel as though they are infantilized or disrespected. And a lot of that comes from how we use our language. So a couple examples, just like we all like to be known by our preferred pronouns. People with disabilities prefer to be known by their either identity or person first need to ask about it, just like we like to ask about identity, pronoun identities. So for example, using the example of autism, we could say that Jim is a person with autism, right, which is person first language, which censors the personhood. Or many people with autism prefer to be known by identity first language, which would be Jim is an autistic, right? This is a very personal choice, and you'll find that people will choose different paths that are right for them. So if Jim, in this case, really feels strongly that having autism is a central part of his identity, he might say, please call me an autistic. Whereas the next person you meet may say that, no, I want my autism to be less salient in my identity, so please call me a person with autism, right? And you need to figure that out as part of showing respect. I think talking to people in tones that are age appropriate are really important. Oftentimes I see professionals talking to people with disabilities as if they're infants, even though they're 18 years old. And we shouldn't do that any more than we would if we met a stranger at a high school football game. I think need to consider people with disabilities and their families as equal partners in making decisions, which means that before you refer to any service, you need to talk through that with the family and the child, so that everyone is bought in, everyone understands what they've been getting into. Yeah, and don't rely on the caregivers too much. Don't let the caregivers just speak for the child. Oftentimes the children will have their own perspective, just like any other child will, especially as you get into adolescence. A child with disability will have their own identity forming, just like a kid without a disability. So let the child speak for themselves. Don't rely on the caregiver exclusively. And this one is hard. I think this one can be really hard in any work setting, but I think sometimes it's particularly hard in a setting like child welfare, that we don't want to go in assuming that something about a person needs to be fixed, right? Oftentimes in the disability space, professionals come in, see what they perceive to be a problem, and assume that that problem has to be fixed. That's not cool in the disability world. In the disability world, we like to think of disability as something that's as personal to you as your gender or your race. And just like gender or race don't need to be fixed, neither do disabilities. Unless the person says, you know what, my speech is really a problem in my life and I want to address my speech, in which case that's cool, help facilitate that. But kind of let the child and their family be the drivers, and don't assume straight up that you have to fix something.
Thank you all for your responses. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question that we have. So the next question is, what resources are available for service delivery to families and individuals with developmental disabilities, and how accessible are those resources?
Well, that is a tough question. That's an unanswerable question. I'll start by saying that a student from the LEN program, her name is Hannah Doherty. She's a doctor and occupational therapy student who's also in the Virginia LEN program. She was kind enough to put together a resource list aimed at child welfare workers that has tons of hyperlinked resources, some of which are Virginia specific, some of which are more broadly based, that you may find helpful, and we will share that at the end of the session and also on the Center, the Child Welfare Stipend Program's website. So we're very thankful that Hannah took the time to do that for us. What kinds of resources are available and how accessible? I would say it really depends on what type of disability you're talking about, where the child and the family are in their journey and in their development, their amenability to certain services. I would say that services in Virginia are lacking generally. So for most any service that we're talking about or thinking about doing, you'll want to check in so wait lists and that sort of thing. We just have a real lack of service providers, especially those who are disability competent. So kind of knowing the landscape will be very, very helpful. A couple things in particular I point out. The waivers are really important for many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think that maybe Heather can talk more to that. I think also that families oftentimes have a hard time navigating systems and oftentimes want to talk to someone who's like them. So one resource that I would really point out for that is the Center for Family Involvement at the Partnership for People with Disabilities. It's linked in the resource guide that we'll share with you. That is a family-to-family network that's focused on disability, where a person can call in, talk to another family member who's got experience in navigating certain systems, and they can kind of talk through the process. There are some Spanish-speaking advocates. There's an Arabic-speaking advocate, of course, English-speaking advocates. So they provide a great service, and there's no charge to it. So that's one resource that is linked in the resource guide that Hannah, our occupational therapy student, put together that you can check out.
From a child welfare standpoint, this can be one of the most frustrating things. I do not have challenges accessing services that provided through early intervention. Obtaining, sometimes the system getting an IEP and that child study process can be a little muddy, but overall that is not where my area of concern is. My biggest area of concern is for those individuals. I primarily work with teenagers and those who participate in the Fostering Futures program, which are voluntary services till the age of 21, where I'm seeing the biggest gap in those that may have an intellectual disability. However, they don't meet criteria for a waiver. I'm working with a young man that will be 21 in November, and I don't know where he's going to go. He's currently in an supervised IL program with us, where he's getting very intensive daily skills training, IL skills training to help him to successfully transition to adulthood. He's been denied a waiver twice because of the housing crisis that we are all aware of, and because of the Section 8 housing list that takes is average about 4 years to come off of. I don't know where he is going to go when he turns 21. And we are having that discussion about he may be homeless. I will 100% ensure that does not happen, but resources for him are limited. He is connected with the Community Services Board. However, for an adult that receives ID case management, that is one face-to-face visit every 90 days. That looks completely different from the support that he is receiving right now. So how do I help link him with services that are going to aid in that transition once he is no longer connected with social services?
Yeah, that's a great point, Heather. So I'm kind of thinking back again, I'm more macro oriented, so thinking about some of those other resources. So first, for our children and youth who are in foster care, when they have higher degrees of needs, there is what we call the VMAT process, which is the Virginia Enhanced Maintenance something tool. And so, but that is where if you have a child or youth who's in foster care who has a higher degree of needs, and you need to find a placement for them that's really going to need to provide a whole lot more, we have that tool that will allow for a higher amount of funding per month, so that the foster parent is receiving more funding to help meet the needs of that child. So that's one resource that is at the fingertips of the foster care worker. But going back to thinking about what Heather was talking about, some of our older youth that wind up aging out of foster care, so turning 18 while they're in foster care. And we do know that some of those young people do have developmental disabilities. So one, making sure that, again, we're leaning on those partnerships, making sure that there is, especially for those that have been identified, that they are earlier in high school working on that transition plan. And I'm talking about that school transition plan, because we over on the child welfare side also have a transition plan. And so, but combining those transition plans, right? Because they talk about a lot of the same things about their education, about their daily needs. And so combining those transition plans to make sure that they're getting the services that they need. I also just can't help but think about going back and what are we doing earlier to make sure that these young people are finding permanency before that, right? How are we supporting those families that they came to us from, so that they have what they need for those young people to return to those homes? What about relatives who also know these young people? So maybe the parents or caregivers that were originally in place when the child came into foster care, unfortunately, are not going to be an option for them. How are we supporting their relatives, and I do mean legal blood relatives, as well as what we sometimes refer to as fictive kin, people that they say are family that maybe wouldn't otherwise be documented as family. What are we doing to support those permanent placements so that when they turn 18, when they turn 21, they have those support systems in place? And so that's all that kind of that bigger systemic work, and how are we working with our young people and our families to get that support in place, so that when they do leave us, they're prepared, their families are prepared to be successful.
And I do want to note, just piggybacking off of what Ms. Kelley had said, the VMAT that she referenced, that is only applicable for those children who are placed in foster home settings.
Thank you. Thank you all for your responses. We do have a question from the chat. Are there some developmental disabilities that don't affect or obviously affect IQ?
Yes, many. Obviously, intellectual disability is kind of defined by IQ. And then other disabilities may or may not have an intellectual component to them. Autism sometimes does, sometimes does not. Fetal alcohol sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. Cerebral palsy, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So it really sort of depends on each individual person. The best thing to do is just to get assessed. There's actually a sort of a movement away from IQ testing in some circles in the disability community, because IQ tests were developed out of ableist and in fact racist logic. So we feel a little uncomfortable with IQ tests in the disability community. We know that they're still used. So we prefer to talk about limitations in cognitive functioning or intellectual functioning. So we speak about it more functionally. That being said, the best thing to do is to get assessed if you're wondering about intellectual functioning, because it can depend. It doesn't necessarily operate in attachment to a particular diagnosis.
Does anyone have any follow-up response to that, or would you like the final question? Okay, so in closing for our audience members, while we are answering the final question, we are going to send out a form so you can give us some feedback and tell us what other learning opportunities you would like to see offered for future events. So the final question for our panelists is, What recommendations do you have for policymakers, practitioners, state leaders, and researchers who are joining us today? What change efforts should we see as a social work community and put some energy behind?
From a child welfare worker's perspective, I would love to see and think it would be very, very beneficial to have those who are providing that direct work to the individuals that we serve at the table when discussions are had. I have found from my experience, there's huge difference in the conceptual perspective and a practical perspective in regards to child welfare and the way that our work is done.
First and foremost, my advice for policymakers, practitioners, leaders, researchers is to make sure that you're talking to those with lived expertise, right? Make sure that their voice is heard. It is amazing how much knowledge can be gleaned from those with that lived expertise who have been through these systems, who are living with a developmental disability, who are part of a family that have gone through some of these systems. Getting that information from them is really so important, and I just can't reiterate that enough. And all the way down to the caseworker perspective, right? Talking with those families, really, we really need to mirror that at all levels, right? We talk about how important it is for our local departments of social services to work with the families. They need to have those family partnership meetings, the child and family team meetings that are incorporating what the family wants and needs. Our policymakers and everybody in between need to have that too, right? Really gleaning from the expertise of those who are living with developmental disabilities, who have been involved in the child welfare system, so that we can and ask them for their recommendations, and so that we can really come to the place that we need to be able to provide the support that those families need.
Yep, I agree with all that's been said. And I bring us back to a couple of points that have come up earlier in the discussion. Number one is finding ways to address what we call the cliff. After you go through education, going through school, children have a lot of service opportunities, right? The school provides them. There are a lot of services that are intended directly for children. But when someone ages out of school-based services at age 22, we have the cliff where all that falls off, and the child and the family are meant to figure things out on their own. And there are far, far fewer services for adults with developmental disabilities. So helping youth and families prepare for the cliff, and from a policy standpoint to address the cliff, would be very, very helpful. I think another thing that would be very helpful is more coordination between state agencies, especially as a child nears transition age. We see that they get some services from DBHDS, they get other services from DSS, they get some services through their CSP, they get some services through voc rehab, and all of these things are separate entities that don't necessarily communicate well together. So having a coordinating entity to help manage all that would be really, really helpful. And the third thing I'd say is to invest in training the professional workforce to serve people with developmental disabilities and their families. The funding from my program comes from the Federal Maternal and Child Health Bureau, and we work with Title V agencies. So that's one way of doing this, but again, it's a drop in the bucket, and we need more investment to train people from multiple professions in how to serve people with disabilities and their families. My program does 16 different professions, and we're very proud of that. It's a very large training program, but we need so much more of it. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you all. We did have another question from the chat, and I believe we have a little bit of time to answer it. Do you ever have parents who are reluctant to testing or assessments? And if so, how do you encourage the families or children/youth to get assessed?
We do see this often. However, a lot of times when a child is involved with the child welfare system, there is an underlying court order that does state that a parent or caregiver is ordered to comply with any services and recommendations from the department. So from a parent standpoint, that is helpful and beneficial. And then also it goes back to engagement, explaining why that this assessment or evaluation is being recommended. And what we hope to get out of that is more information so that we can fully and continuously assess all aspects of the case. I have found teenagers that do have some disabilities being very reluctant to having evaluations done because deep down they know they're a little different, but they don't want to be reminded of that. And it's hard for them to understand the purpose of the evaluation in order to help guide the framework of what we do with them in order to ensure that they receive the best quality services that can meet their individual needs.
Yeah, don't have much to add to that. I think that's great. I think helping the family and the child see the potential benefits of the assessment is really key, and to give them some volition or some control in how that is done or how they receive the results of it, to the extent possible is really helpful, because I think oftentimes people just see professionals and clam up, because oftentimes we're jerks. I think seeing that we can partner better is important, and giving families and kids some control in how they partner is really useful.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think kind of speaking to what both of you have said, kind of that label, right? Our society isn't nice when it comes to labels on folks. So one, we just kind of need that bigger social change, right? Of issues around labels, but also understanding the unintended consequences, right, of some of those, because we do know that some people have, been labeled, and then they're later down the road on those unintended consequences. We see that. We see young people that get some sort of label, and it's there's some sort of assessment or something that's documented in their file because we know that it's going to help them get the services that they need. But then later down the line, they're barred from some other activity or service or family or something because they have this one thing in their file, right? So really listening to what the family wants and what the family needs, and if they're saying we don't want to do this assessment because we don't want our child to be labeled that way. Let's talk through that. What does that look like? What are the pros and cons? Is the family able to provide for their child without getting those services that would be provided then by getting that service? And if not, how do we, again, go back and encourage them to say, okay, we really think that it would be most beneficial. But if not, let's recognize what the family has to say, and maybe they can maneuver the system without that assessment and that label.
Thank you. So I just wanted to thank the VCU Child Welfare Stipend Program, as well as the Virginia Lynn Program, for coming together to have this opportunity for professionals and experts in the field to talk about disability within child welfare. I want to thank the audience and our panelists for joining us today and making the time to talk about this discussion. There will be a form within the chat for the audience members to fill out to give us some feedback on what you would like to see offered, or resources, or maybe future events. The resource guide for disability will also be in the chat as well. So I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time today to attend and have this conversation. And yeah. So thank you all for joining us.